All right, let's get started. To begin, we acknowledge that the land we are broadcasting from is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land and recognize their achievements and their contributions to our community. We also recognize the contributions Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and our province and country as a whole. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our community. Today is Orange Shirt Day, and it's a day to acknowledge the harmful impact residential schools have on Indigenous children. It's an opportunity to create meaningful discussion about the effects of residential schools and the legacy they have left behind. A day for survivors to be reaffirmed that they matter, and so do those that have been affected. I will be introducing our speakers in just a moment, but before I do, I'd like to provide a bit of information about impact investing at KWCF. KWCF's first foray into impact investing was born out of a desire by our board to maximize the social returns and the community impact of its investment. Our board of directors has now approved $8 million to be invested for impact. The current focus for KWCF's impact investments is aligned in general with our three strategic areas of focus, that being affordable housing, healthy children and youth, and social inclusion. However, we are always open to investments in other areas that demonstrate strong, positive social or environmental impact. In 2017, we were proud to support our first two affordable housing projects with loans to Housing Cambridge and the Women's Crisis Services of Waterloo Region. We are now currently invested in a dozen or so other projects, one of which is Windmill Microlending, and we are thrilled to have Claudia from Windmill joining us today. So, one last thing I'd like to share before introducing our speakers is a bit about an interesting project which we were able to partner with the community. And that was House of Friendship's Addiction Center initiative called Close to Home. They had raised $2 million in donations, had thanked all their donors, and then realized that the opioid crisis had really hit the region hard, and they would require an additional $1 million in order to expand the space to respond to the new demand on their services. We provided the House of Friendship with a grant. They then engaged MARS, Center for Impact Investing, to determine the best path forward. They decided to launch a community investment bond. KWCF came in as the lead investor for the project with a $200,000 investment, and within a few short months, House of Friendship was able to raise an additional $900,000 through individual accredited investors at $100,000 each. Part of our grant also went to fund a case study that is now available to you and to all Waterloo Region charitable organizations who are considering impact investment. Please visit our website to check it out. This has taught us that we must look for opportunities to draw private capital into the double bottom line that impact investing offers. I would now like to invite our speakers to join us on screen. Joining us today is Tania Carnegie, leader and chief catalyst of the Impact Ventures practice at KPMG in Canada. Tim Jackson, president and CEO at SHAD Canada, and also a KWCF board member and chair of both our social finance and our investment committees. And Claudia Hepburn, CEO of Windmill Microlending and KWCF Impact Investment recipient. You will find the bios of these accomplished speakers in the chat, but I just wanted to pull out a few key highlights. So first for Tania, for over a decade, Tania was a member of the royal household at Buckingham Palace, serving as a lady-in-waiting to the Countess of Wessex. Tim served on the Canadian Task Force on Social Finance and was Canada's representative on the G7 Social Impact Investment Task Force when he led the Mars Center for Impact Investing. And Claudia has been named one of Canada's top 25 women of influence and is a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. As you can see, we have a rock star panel, and so let's jump into the conversation. First, Tim, maybe we'll start with you. What is impact investing and what is it not?
Sure. So very simply, an impact investment is an investment whereby there is the intention to generate not just a financial return, but also a social return. Very, very simple concept. It's generally accepted that in order for something to be deemed an impact investment, there have to be three characteristics. So it has to be intentionality on the part of the investor to generate both of those returns, financial and social. There has to be intentionality on the part of the investee to generate both financial and social returns. And there has to be an agreement that the social impact will be measured. And that's negotiated or discussed and settled between the borrower and the lender. And so it differs from, or to say what is not an impact investment is where social benefit is a byproduct. So for example, you might invest in a company that's a for-profit entity that chooses to then invest its profits in something social. That would not be deemed to be a social or an impact investment because the nature of your investment did not generate that social return. It was a byproduct. Likewise, there are many companies out there that their products do some social good, but because it's not intentional, that would not qualify for what we would traditionally in the sector call an impact investment.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. That was a fantastic explanation. And so, Tania, I guess over to you. What are impact funds and what are they used for?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Elizabeth. So impact funds are really similar to any other type of investment fund. They're used to enable diversification. The work that I do is primarily in the private equity and asset management space. So perhaps I'll give you a couple examples just to illustrate how some of these funds have come to be and how they're used. So a number of large private equity firms like TPG and KKR, for example, they have launched impact funds. And in doing so, these large private equity firms, what they've done is they've created they've carved out an opportunity to invest in those companies, as Tim was describing, that are creating a solution through the products and services that they offer to a societal or an environmental challenge, and that is what's forming the impetus for investment, and then the opportunity to grow that impact as the business grows. So some of the common themes that we've seen as these impact funds are being formed and investments are being made is, the fund manager, they're looking to play to their strengths. So if they have a particular focus on a sector or a geographic focus, they're looking to really build upon that. And then taking that one step further to now bring an impact lens to say, all right, where is it that we think as an investor we can drive some really meaningful change? And in many cases, by launching an impact fund, it's enabling them to invest in types of companies that they wouldn't otherwise as a firm. So for example, one of our clients, their impact fund, is targeting, small to mid-sized companies where they're typically investing in much larger companies. So this is enabling them to still build on their strengths, but move into a different part of the market. And then I think from an investor side, what we see is a number of investors who are very focused on impact investing. So they're looking at these impact funds as an opportunity to diversify their holdings. In other cases, some investors that we see are what we might call impact curious. So they're looking at an investment in impact fund as a way to get exposure to different types of companies, different types of impact thesis and experience that can then inform their own practice. So as I said at the beginning, used in a similar way to traditional funds, but obviously with some very important nuances around impact.
That's great, Tania. I love that term, impact curious. Tim, I mean, maybe you could sort of demystify some of these things. I hear about, you know, environmental, social, and governance, so ESG. So how is ESG investing different than impact investing? And how does it complement impact investing?
So ESG is really taking a lens to look at potential investments and saying, how do they measure up environmentally, socially, and from a governance standpoint? So you might have someone evaluate a public company that does very well on all those things, but would not be deemed to be an impact investment. By the same token, you might have a public company where they're bribing people in other countries. They perhaps are providing arms or bullets or guns, and you decide that that's not consistent with your values. And so ESG is often the start of someone's impact investing journey. And it's essentially a do no harm approach. And so whether it's a foundation, whether it's a pension fund, whether it's an individual investor, they may very well start by saying, I'm going to look at my portfolio, and the first thing I'm going to do is eliminate companies that don't share my values. And that's putting an ESG lens on those investments. It's as you go through the continuum, the next step would be going to an impact investment where now I'm being intentional about it. So instead of saying I'm not going to invest in things that don't share my values, I'm now going to deliberately invest in things that share my values, have a social and financial return. And so it's the continuum is you will often start with ESG and then move into impact investing.
Okay, that's great. A great explanation. And so, Claudia, you know, we very deliberately made an investment into Windmill Microlending. And so, you know, as we all know, impact investing needs to have a social or environmental return alongside a financial return. So, Claudia, with your experience as an investee, what are investors looking for to be able to show that social return?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. And particularly for your foundation's investment in Windmill. So really, you know, one of the challenging things for investee organizations is that whereas an investee organization that was only looking to provide a financial return, every normal investor is looking for a financial return. They're looking for low financial risk and high financial returns. The challenge for investee companies that are offering impact is that, you know, there is many different flavors of value investment as there are impact investors. So the challenge is not only to show clear, demonstrable, long-term metrics of social impact or environmental impact, but also to be able to carve that in different ways that are going to relate to and inspire the values of different impact investors. Because no impact investor only comes with one mandate. You know, for instance, your foundation has a local region, a local impact mandate, and a social inclusion, you know, mandate that we would relate to. So as an investee organization, we have to be able to go to community foundations across the country and investors across the country who may all want to know how many loans are we serving, how many people in a particular local geography that investor is interested in. And also maybe an investor might be interested in healthcare particularly, or they might be interested in refugees, or they might be interested in, you know, poverty alleviation and social justice issues, or a particular cultural or professional group. So it's a challenge for investees to be able to slice and dice their returns in ways that are both manageable for them to manage on an investor relations basis that isn't too time consuming and expensive. But also provide that great sense of satisfaction to an impact investor who really wants to make a difference in a particular area that's close to their heart.
Oh, very good. Well, we're certainly very satisfied with our investment and the social returns that you're making, Claudia, at Windmill. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You know, on that theme of measurement, I remember I attended the SOCAP conference, Social Capital Conference a couple of years ago, and I thought, okay, I was determined I was going to find out the secret recipe for measuring impact. Our due diligence committee continuously goes, but you know, we can measure the financial return of an investment, but how do we measure the social or environmental return? And so I thought, okay, the US, they're many years ahead of us with impact investing, and so maybe they had found the solution. They had not. One of the first sessions I went to, they said, well, that's work for the next decade. And I'm like, oh, jeepers. So, I'll open this question up to all of you. So please feel free to jump in. So are there any tips or tricks that you've discovered over the years around measuring the impact of an investment?
Well, for us, it's definitely being able to measure what is a client's state when they come in and we begin to service them, and what is their outcome state at the end when they've achieved the goals that they set out to achieve on their learning plan and employment. And so by being able to measure at the beginning and at the end of the process and provide, demonstrated returns in our case, we do it with income increases, reduction in unemployment, and in some cases increase and repayment rate. So we have a 98% repayment rate. So those are our key ones. And just being able to quote those, in an elevator pitch in 30 seconds is something that we find very powerful. But it's really not every impact investee is able to do that, which is what makes it so hard.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. Tim, Tania?
Sure. And similarly to Claudia's experience, with the types of clients and portfolio companies that we're exposed to and that we're working with, these are commercial organizations, and still it's being able to focus on identifying those metrics that are most meaningful and indicative of the impact that's being created, and how that impact is evolving. So from a commercial perspective, what we see is the importance of focusing on those metrics that are also related to operations. And I say this because in the commercial context, what a lot of our clients and a lot of impact investors in the commercial context focus on is something called collinearity. So that's the idea that, impact grows as a company grows, or as, the company is scaling, its presence in the market, that's what's enabling the impact to grow. So it's really coming up with those core, most relevant metrics, but also not just focusing on the measurement piece, but focusing on impact management. So how is it that you're using that information throughout the life of the investment, working with management of the company to really make sure that impact is being considered as part of business decisions, and not just something, at the beginning and at the end of a financial period or a reporting period.
Yeah, no, that's really important.
And I think, Elizabeth, it's important that people try to be flexible, particularly as this is an evolving space. And I think about, for example, what was probably Canada's first national or relatively national in scope social impact bond, which was the Heart and Stroke Foundation initiative that was funded, or the outcomes funder was Public Health Agency of Canada. It was a goal to reduce the number of senior citizens that go from being pre-hypertensive to becoming hypertensive. And so ultimately there was a negotiation, and there it was between three parties. You had investors, you had Heart and Stroke, and you had Public Health Agency of Canada. And they ultimately settled on two measurements. One was pure participation. So how many people actually participated in the intervention? And second was an actual measurement of reduction in blood pressure. And so they came, I thought, to a really good balance that said, one will look at the absolute impact that the intervention by Heart and Stroke has, and the other recognizes we're just going to measure the number of people that got involved in the intervention. And I think the key to that is that people were flexible, because I think all of us, Tania, Claudia, and I have also always seen examples where you have potential impact investments that get hung up on the measurement, and it can kill a deal. It can be, everything else can be settled, and then so now how are we going to measure this? And so particularly as this space is evolving, I think we just have to recognize that the measurement piece will also evolve, and early on we probably need to be a little bit flexible with each other.
Okay, yeah, great. All excellent points. Tania, wealth managers in traditional financial institutions play a role in impact investing. So what does that look like? How do they engage investors? I know, having been in that business before, impact investing was a thing. So I am, certainly curious to know, how do traditional wealth managers intersect in this space?
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is a really, impact investing is a really hot topic and an important area in the wealth management space. In particular, as we've been reading over the past few years about the, massive transfer of wealth that's happening between the generations, as we speak, the interest of, the next generation in really thinking about the impact that they have very holistically with their whole share of wallet, not just how they might support a charitable organization, but how that influences their purchases and certainly how that influences their investment decisions. So given that it's so important, I mean, where we see the starting point is having those conversations with wealth management clients. So for, investment advisors to be proactive and for themselves to be, educated and understanding what the different options are so that they can, properly engage their clients in a discussion to understand what are the kinds of things that are important to them, and then how they play that information back to inform product development and to inform, other types of programming and opportunities to engage their clients. So that really is a fundamental starting point.
Yeah, interesting. I kind of giggled a little to myself thinking that there probably were some wealth managers that were a little surprised when their client came to them and said, I'd like to take 100,000 of my portfolio to invest in the House of Friendship. And they would have, wait a minute, what? And so I think you're right. There's an important role for wealth managers, and certainly, we look for opportunities to engage with wealth managers to share some of the opportunities that we're seeing as well, that they can co-invest. So,
well, and I think just to build on that, and I think that's really important that you're doing that, Elizabeth, because as Tim was explaining, what is impact investing at the start of this call, it's a very big tent, and there are lots of different opportunities that fit within the three criteria that Tim had mentioned. I've been talking about the private equity type of investments, which are very commercial investments, pursuing commercial rates of return in commercial businesses. The work that you're doing, that Claudia is doing, obviously represents other very important opportunities as part of that. And I think that individuals, wealth managers, just across the board, people sometimes have a preconceived notion about what an impact investment is, or about a risk return profile. So I think the more that we are showcasing the different types of opportunities, the greater the opportunity to bring people in, to bring capital in, and to grow this space, and obviously to grow impact as a result.
Really interesting. Tim and I were actually speaking earlier today about the risk and return, and opining on whether you needed to, a few years ago it was always, well, you have to take a concessionary return in order to make an impact investment. And Tim, jump in if you'd like, just around that.
Yeah, absolutely not. And you referenced the House of Friendship example locally. And I think for the most part, the individual investors who went into that House of Friendship community bond took money out of their fixed income portfolio and simply moved it into this and got, I would argue, given today's rates, an actual higher return than they would probably be getting if they reinvested. But the point was, so for us in our community, it was a way to simply say to people, you don't have to do something abnormal with your funds. We explained why that investment was a secure investment. In that particular case, the investment was secured by the property. So it's very much like a mortgage on the property, as I say. And so people said, well, yeah, I'm prepared to take a piece of my fixed income, take it out of the bond market and put it into something that will help my community and generate exactly the same return I would have had. But now I've got the benefit of both a social return and a financial return.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in there?
Please.
You brought up a point of view that is an important one, but representing the charitable sector here on this call, I'd also like to point out that from my perspective, I wish we could get away from this message that, oh, you can always get a return that's equal when you do a social impact investment, and you should be expecting that. Because I think there is so much great work being done in the charitable sector that could provide some kind of financial return, but we've got to get away from thinking about, if you're gonna look at charities, you either make a donation, which is none of it is coming back to you, or you make an investment, and in which case you're going to get top rate market return, and it's a get rich quick scheme, and there's no risk to it. Like, we've got to work with that gray middle ground in between those two, and look at that. That wouldn't it be great for some investors to say, all I want is a return on my capital, or for some to say, I'll take this little bit of, I just want to cover the the real rate of the cost of capital. And others who might say, you know what, I can afford to lose 10% each year on this investment because the impact is so strong that this investment is making. And it's so much better deal. I can leverage my money so much more by making an investment rather than a philanthropic donation. And I just think that we're gonna have a much richer conversation if we can expand the conversation to include those ideas.
Really important points, Claudia. Absolutely. I'm going to jump to a question from the audience. So this one is from Harvey, and is participation of key non-financial stakeholders on boards and in management a consideration?
So I'd love to jump into that one. So if you're talking about an investee company or charity, in our case, it is very important to me to have board members and staff members, senior staff members, who are both great at finance. So I've got a great director of finance and risk, who's a CFA, and I have an amazing director of client success, who is an immigrant herself, he spent 20 years working in the immigrant employment sector. And so those are super important. On my board, I also have lots of people who have rich personal lived experience as immigrants, and also great finance people on my board. And that's absolutely a critical part of, from my perspective, of having a great impact organization.
Mm-hmm.
And Elizabeth, can I touch?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, can I touch on it from the other side? And I know, Harvey, you've asked the follow-up question: is it an indicator of impact in its own right? It would be for ESG, absolutely. It would not necessarily be, directly for an impact investment. But from an investor standpoint, as impact investing has sort of emerged, we've seen the need to change boards and management on the side of the portfolio that has the funds. And so when you go back and you think about the traditional setup of whether it's a community foundation, a family foundation, often a pension fund, they will have an investment committee that is made up of investment professionals. And so there needs to be a mind shift as to who those people are and or how they think, because you see this with a family foundation. We would run into this all the time. The grandparents would have generated some wealth that gets passed on. Mom and dad were running the foundation. Their legacy was to pass it on to what are now the grandkids of the ultimate founders. But the message they would leave the investment committee was, don't let the kids, piss away this money. So you need to monitor the kids. And the kids would be saying, well, we want to do good with this. But you have a bunch of investment professionals who are saying, nope, we just want this in the traditional 60-40 equity fixed income split. We don't want to touch any of this newfangled impact investing stuff. So it needs that change. And foundations across the world are changing the makeup of their board members and their investment committee members to reflect that investment or impact investing is a critical part of the role that foundations can play.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Thank you. Tania, anything you want to add to that question while our audience thinks of another question?
Sure, and maybe just to take the portfolio company perspective, or just a corporate perspective in general, because this shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism is one of the #1 things that we are, talking to our clients about right now, that they're coming to us and asking about. And it's really about understanding what are the expectations that your stakeholders have of you as an organization. But then in understanding those expectations, you're making decisions as a business to enable you to better address needs in the market, to better engage customers and employees, the broader community. And I think it's critical to be an impactful organization, but I agree with you, Tim. I don't think it's impact in and of itself.
Okay. Well, we do have another question. This one's from Lori. So this question is about what are the first steps that a not-for-profit should consider when they're thinking of the possibility of leveraging impact investments? What do boards and what do CEOs or executive directors need to consider? And so, for example, what are the key success factors? Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to take a first crack, and then Claudia should jump in because she presumably did it with her board. But I think if an organization is thinking about leveraging impact investing, the first thing they have to do is say, is this appropriate for us? So it does not replace philanthropy. So there needs to be some sort of repayment possibility available. Whether that is full repayment or, as Claudia suggests, whether people are prepared to take a concessionary return and take something less than full repayment, typically there needs to be some sort of model. So what are you actually looking for an investment for that will generate income or a cash flow stream down the road? But then I think there are the other factors that say, well, should we go get traditional financing or should we try an impact investment? And I think one is, again, to what Claudia said, you may very well be able to get better rates because people are prepared to take a lower rate to say, I want to do something good with my money, which can then have the benefit that you've now got a group of people who may not have been familiar with your organization that now are learning about it. And so House of Friendship, for example, most of the investors that invested in that House of Friendship community bond may have known about House of Friendship, but they weren't donors to House of Friendship. They weren't allocating philanthropic dollars, and there's no guarantee they will, but at least now they have a relationship with the organization, so you never know what it might lead to. So those are some of the thoughts or things that I think a board should consider.
That was a really important point, Tim, that you mentioned about the House of Friendship. I call them, they have these 9 other sort of disciples now who are keenly interested in the work of House of Friendship, perhaps more so than had they solely given philanthropic dollars. They have a keen interest in this project or this program that they're delivering and succeeding. And so it's really interesting to see how that played out. Tania, would you like to, or actually Claudia, we mentioned Claudia answering this question. Would you like to jump in?
Oh, there's no, Tim, you did a great job of answering it. So from when we set about doing it, you first of all, having a long track record is super helpful, because if you can prove that you've been doing something repeatedly. So for us, the fact that we now have a 15-year track record of 97 to 98% repayment, that gives people a lot of comfort that you're going to be able to continue to deliver that. So if you're a new organization with an unproven model, you might be able to do one of those social impact bonds that you were talking about, where there's a government player and a risk investor player who's looking to get a big financial return if it pays off. But so how well proven is an important consideration, and then be very clear about what this funding is going to. And so for instance, we have our operating budget. None of our community bonds go to cover the support costs that go into helping our clients be successful. We raise that from philanthropists, corporations, and government and foundations. The community bonds that we raise just go to loan capital. And so we've raised about $10 million right now with our community bond. That's enabled us to triple our loan capital that's put out there to clients, and that's going to really help us scale. And the other interesting point that we didn't anticipate, which again you brought up, so I'm just reinforcing here, is that sometimes it's a great way for philanthropists to get to know an organization and say, hey, I want to see how good a custodian you are of my funds. And so I'm going to make an impact investment first and see how you manage it. And maybe down the road, I might want to turn that into a donation if I think that you're doing a great job.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Tania, anything to add to that question before I move on to the next?
You know, I think just to emphasize what Tim and Claudia have said about, you know, being really clear on the business case, and then having the right business model to support an impact investment offering.
Yeah, you know, we're just participating right now in the investment readiness program. So, you know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that, but just for our audience sake, in 2018, the federal government launched an $805 million social finance fund. And they learned from the UK, who had done something similar a number of years before, and knew that just putting the money out there did not mean that organizations would really be ready necessarily to participate in that finance. And so they carved out 50 million of that 805 million to put out there in this investment readiness program. And the Community Foundations of Canada were one of the successful applicants to deploy those funds across the country. And the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation, along with a consortium of partners locally, are moving that money out. And so we're into our second round of applications now. That just opened earlier in September and ends in a couple of weeks. And so I think it's just interesting as we've been exposed then to a whole new type of organization than what we were used to before. So community foundations traditionally interact with pure charity. Yes, sometimes not for profits if they have fiscal sponsors, because that's generally a condition we need to have in order to do our granting. But from our impact investing perspective, charities were really all that was in our purview at the time. And so now with this investment readiness program, it's really opened this whole new segment of characters, cast of characters that we interact with regards to social enterprises. So I'm curious, you know, from Tim, Claudia, Tania's perspective, when the government launches the rest of this financing, which I haven't heard anything different, but I assume is coming in 2021, you know, what are some of the opportunities for people that are, for organizations, like we talked about what do they need to do to get ready themselves, but is there anything else you would talk about when you're thinking of securing government financing? So will there be additional maybe strings attached to that, for instance, compared to what you might see from a foundation?
I'll take a first crack, but so I think that there's a couple of things. One is I think we need to be really clear that this does not eliminate government's responsibility to provide a social safety net. So there's a fear that impact investing can have a government say, well, we're now out of the game. We'll do it all through outcomes-based financing. So I think it has to be in addition to the social supports that we traditionally expect government to provide. The other piece that is a struggle with dealing with governments is the inability to accept failure. There will be impact investments that don't work, like any investments, and it becomes very difficult around the government table sometimes to get an impact investment through and approved until they say, we know this one's going to work. And I remember Ontario tried for the longest time to do its first social impact bond, and at the time the ADM just kept saying, this has to work, this has to work, this has to work. And so, you know, whereas private investors and foundations may have a bit of a higher risk tolerance, we do have to be careful that, you know, government recognizes that we have to fail to innovate, and sometimes they're not the best people to do that.
Interesting perspective. Yes, Tim, for sure. Anything else? I mean, Claudia, is that financing something that's on the radar of Windmill?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you hear the number 800 million, everybody's ears perk up and think, well, maybe there's a piece that could be helpful to our organization. They're also these things take years to work themselves through to the details, so we're interested in seeing that. We're also concerned that, you know, if a big sum like that isn't isn't done right, it can really shift the market and distort the market. And whereas from my perspective, so it's really exciting if this is done well and is executed well. It has the potential to bring in a lot more money and really help the whole sector improve and grow. But if it's not done really, really well, it has the potential to be very distortionary. And so we're following it with great interest. But so it has lots of potential.
I also hope it's not overly prescriptive. I mean, Tania and I had the privilege of spending some time together in the UK and seeing some presentations by senior officials at the UK who are doing impact investing. And one of the things that I thought was very cool that they did, the Cabinet Office in the UK published a list of costs that they had estimated. The cost to remove a child from a single parent cost the taxpayer X dollars per year over this period of time. It costs the taxpayers X dollars to incarcerate someone, costs Y dollars to incarcerate a youth. And they said, if you have ideas where you think you can come up with interventions that will that will cost less than that intervention, come and tell us about it. And I thought, what a brilliant concept, just basically saying we're not going to be overly prescriptive and encouraging innovation. And I would hope something similar happens here where we're not overly bureaucratic and prescriptive and let the market figure out, because people like Claudia and her colleagues across the country are running these organizations that know how to come up with solutions to some of the big problems we face. Well, let's let them go at it rather than government just trying to decide exactly how it should be done.
That's a great point, Tim, and absolutely worth making. One counter to that argument is that sometimes I really wish that governments would put and investors would put more emphasis on the value of scaling up proven solutions than just looking for the next shiny idea that might possibly work, because there are solutions out there that are solving big social problems, and they just need the funding to scale.
Well, and that's exactly what happened with the Heart and Stroke project. Heart and Stroke had this very, very small pilot they had done where they believed by a combination of diet and exercise and intervention with seniors, they could ensure these seniors did not become hypertensive, but they did not have the funds to do a mass rollout. And that's where Public Health Agency of Canada came in and said, we'll do it. I think it was Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver was the plan to say, okay, we've got this pilot, let's roll it. So 100% agree with you, Claudia, completely agree.
And just to add to
please.
So I was part of the federal steering group, the Federal Social Innovation and Social Finance Steering Group that made the recommendation for the creation of the fund that you mentioned, Elizabeth. And there were a number of recommendations that accompanied that. And one of the things that we were very cognizant of is the whole awareness and understanding piece. Just recognizing that the idea of social finance or impact investing is still a very new concept for most people, and to really to really bring people along the journey so that they understand like why a charity might need investment capital more than they would need philanthropic capital, or how the two could coexist. And with that understanding, comes the flexibility, the ability to iterate, and to fail successfully, like to fail forward, so that this space can continue to grow and evolve. And without that, I think there could be just a lot of concerns around why would anyone do this? Where's the accountability? Like just so many questions that could actually get in the way of some real progress and real impact. And Claudia, as you were saying, like really putting money into organizations to help, scale proven solutions. So for me, that's always been just such a critical element, not to shortcut.
Mm-hmm.
And Tania, you've played such an important role in this country in developing this sector. So really hats off to you for the work you've done educating not just the government, but corporations, investors, and all the rest of it. So thanks so much. Keep it up. Keep it up.
For sure.
Well, it's a team effort, Claudia and Tim, as you well know. So
it's
So
always
we all
amazing.
need to.
I remember, when I was heading the Center for Impact Investing, and Tania and her colleagues at KPMG co-authored some reports, and Tania and I would get together for breakfast, and I would say, how are the partners letting you do this? Because there's no economics in this yet. I mean, there's going to be, and I do think it's kudos to the firm at KPMG for saying, we know we're going to have to invest in this because we want to be seen as experts as this market expands, and it needs people like that, because in addition to the folks on the ground, to your point about the investment readiness fund, Elizabeth, we need advisors to some of these organizations who can help them figure out, is impact investing something that's appropriate for them?
Yeah, and that sort of plays in nicely to what I was going to ask you next, which is around, we've discovered some really interesting prospective opportunities for a social impact bond. And so in the conversations we've been having through the investment readiness program, so how do we help the organization structure that? Like, who are the experts, and how do they connect with them? Does there always have to be a government body to be that outcomes funder? And if not, can you please give some advice to our panelists, to our participants, to myself, for how do we help organizations who really have a fantastic model, whether it be scaling an existing opportunity or existing program that they have, or whether it be launching something new? Who do they go to first?
You guys answer this. You two
All
are the
right.
experts.
Well, let me start. So a social impact bond, I think it's relatively complicated, and you typically need someone who is a facilitator. So there's actually typically 4 people involved in a social impact bond. So you have the agency that is providing some sort of intervention. You have investors in the bond. You have an outcomes funder, and I'll answer your question in a second, Elizabeth. But then there's usually a 4th party that is coordinating everything, who may or may not be separate from an evaluator. So you could have a 5th person. But to answer, an outcomes funder does not need to be a government. It can absolutely be a foundation who says, we believe in X. We fund belonging. We fund inclusiveness. We fund whatever it might be. One of the things that's important to us might be housing, ensuring people have affordable and stable housing. So they can also say, we will be an outcomes funder if an intervention happens that improves or reduces, say, homelessness in a community. We're going to fund that, and we're going to provide and the funding then goes to repay the investors who provided the intervening nonprofit with money to be able to go and do their intervention. So it does not have to be government. It has traditionally been in the early ones across the world, but it actually I think it makes complete sense that ultimately it would be foundations. Because if you're sitting there running a foundation, whether it's a broad one like the Kitchen Water Community Foundation, or whether you're a foundation that has one particular area of focus, why would you not say, if you do something good in our area of focus, we'll provide funding to support that?
Mm-hmm. Tania, anything, or Claudia, sorry, please jump in.
Go ahead.
Just to add that, we've played a role in a number of social impact bonds around the world. So acting as an advisor to that intermediary, in particular as a financial advisor. So helping them to think about, not only the business case, but helping from a corporate finance perspective. So putting together the offering documents, like all of those very unglamorous sides, but necessary sides of things. We've also played a role in helping with the design or helping with the measurement. So I think if there are people who are thinking about a social impact bond, just to recognize that, as an investment, there are those typical kinds of investment considerations in addition to the impact considerations. So working with your accountants, your financial advisors, your legal counsel, just working with people you trust who understand the space, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
And could I just add that I'm not sure if everybody on the call is familiar with the difference between a social impact bond and the simpler investment tool of a community bond. Good so point. The social impact bond has the 4 or 5 players, as Tim pointed out, And one of the frustrations with those is because they are so complex and have so many different players, they're really hard and expensive and time consuming to try and put together. And I think so from my perspective, having worked with a community bond, which only involves Windmill and the investor, two people agree on very, very simple GIC, it's a promissory note with a GIC-like rate of return, 1, 3, or 5 years. I just think the ease and the simplicity is such a big, big selling feature that it took us 2 months to work with SBX to design it. And we've got, you know, probably 35 investors right now in the past 2.5 years.
Okay, no, that's fantastic. And Claudia, I'm going to give you the last word. You know, Windmill Microlending has been doing amazing work for the last, I think it's 15 years now. And so are there a few highlights or key points you'd like to share with this audience before we close?
Oh, thank you so much. Windmill, for those who don't know it, is a charity that was founded in Calgary by a wonderful woman called Maria Erickson. And she was working late in her office, as all of us do, and she would speak to the cleaning staff. And she got so frustrated when she found that they were the ones working in her hospital were all internationally trained healthcare professionals. And she, you know, most of us would say, oh, that's too bad. And she was like, no, this is wrong. This can't happen. You've got to stop. And the woman speaking to her said, well, I can't, because I can't save enough in this role to both feed my family and save $5,000 that I need to challenge the exam. So she got a group of her 6 best girlfriends around her kitchen table, and she said, couldn't we solve this if we just raised $25,000 and we could make 5 loans to 5 people, and then if they're successful, they would pay us back and we could make 5 more loans. So they did that. 15 years later, we've made about 5,500 loans across Canada. We have a 98% repayment rate. We're operating in English and French in Quebec as well as of last year. We make interest-free loans to refugees. Our loans are affordable. They combine this magic of affordable credit with coaching supports. So it's that combination of a hands-on, we provide mentorship for our clients, we connect them out to other social service organizations that provide best-in-class supports, and it's a magic combination that allows them to build a solid credit history in Canada, so that when they finished with our loan and repaid us, they have access to all kinds of other you know, affordable banking products, mainstream banking products. And our average client multiplies their income by 3.6 times, 11 times for engineers. So our clients permanently escape poverty with the help on average of a $10,000 loan. So anybody that wants to participate, we need a bigger tent.
Well, that's amazing. And as Harvey just put in the chat, brilliant. And so, you know, thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you, Tania. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today. You know, to the participants, I said they're a rock star panel. I hope you now believe me, vast experience in this field. So thank you very much. And before we go, I'm going to invite MJ Fady, the National Enterprise Leader at KPMG in Canada, to do the closing for us today. MJ, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Tania, Tim, and Claudia, you are thought leaders, not followers, and we are so fortunate to have access to you and your big brains. And Harvey, I completely agree with you. Claudia, you have to love a story that starts with a woman who wouldn't accept no for an answer. And Elizabeth, may I also mention Ainley McKenzie at the KWCF, who organized today's event. Thank you very much. And thank you, Elizabeth, to the KWCF for seizing the opportunity we have to educate and advise and demystify this topic of impact investing. For KPMG's family office practice, by far the most curiosity is around the impact investing pillar of our family office suite of services. And Tim, thank you very much for acknowledging KPMG. You nailed that partner psyche down. But the way we looked at it at KPMG is that we're in a position of privilege to educate, advise on impact investing strategy, perform the third-party independent measurement, report the results, and then help clients tweak and retweak their strategies. So when I say we're in a position of privilege, you know, KPMG is the anti-deal killer because we've got that measurement piece down, and we can help debunk that myth that kids are just pissing away fortunes. And by the way, that's a technical term that Tim used, okay? Don't want you to think it was an extension of the debate last evening that we had engaged in. You know, and the one thing that I would really encourage wealth managers to do is to pivot to wealth strategists, because they need to embrace impact investing. It is here to stay. And finally, I want to say thank you to all our audience members today. You've invested in your time and your intellectual curiosity. And that is really what is going to move the dial here. So I want to say a very big thank you to our participants. And with that, we will sign off and wish everyone a good day.